Good afternoon, and welcome to the last of the lectures for this little course in philosophy. This is the second tutorial day, so we'll be plodding ahead with the rest of philosophy in the Middle Ages, and importantly we'll be dealing with the examinations and how to approach the exam questions. So I've put up some notes from the last lecture, and I'm going to put up some and indeed some stuff that I'm going to cover today. They're simply kind of supplementary notes to the text, and they're designed to make your life a little easier, and that you won't have to, because I'm going to try to power through some of this material. You won't need to frantically take notes or anything like that, because I'll have some version of the material covered in these lecture notes I'm going to put up in the meeting room. I am giving you a good bit of extra reading, not that you need to do the extra reading, simply, as I said before, because students sometimes want to do extra reading, it's better to have access to a decent library rather than flailing around the internet trying to find something that isn't nonsense, which sadly a lot of the stuff that you find, even from seemingly reputable sources, from notes from universities and the like, they perhaps don't read the texts with enough attention to detail. This is very much the case in Thomas Aquinas, where there's some distortion of what Aquinas actually said, because he's a difficult writer, Thomas Aquinas, but not unclear. He's a very, very clear writer. And it's one of the great advantages of the better philosophy in the Middle Ages, is what it shares really with the philosophers I sort of admire, like Bertrand Russell and Moore and these people, is that you don't generally get a room full of people saying, I wonder what he meant here. This is a mark of an unclear philosopher. So you won't find that in Aquinas. So that's why you don't need to become, as I said, you don't need to become an expert in ancient and medieval philosophy overnight. You don't need to become an expert at all for the purposes of the course and the exams. You simply need to answer short questions that show that you understand the material. Again, the answers here are relatively short for the questions shall be asked. They're all on stuff you've covered, and as usual, I'll be pretty much giving you all the information you need in the lectures, and giving you some supplementary things that might be of use to you. In that little booklet that I posted up on one of the first posts, it's a PDF of it. It's not a text document, but a scan. Writing philosophy, essays and exams. Have a little look at that, and it's kind of how to approach examinations is handy, and it's only a couple of pages, and it'll sort of save you time. I won't spend time reading it out to you. That can be better spent. But one thing to remember is, because you've got a limited amount of time to do the answer, and a limited amount of space, a limited number of words, the first thing to do is avoid a long introduction. If you're asked a question on Plato's forms, we don't need to hear about Plato's influence, about his teachers, about his history, about why he was speculating. Everything you say should be in response to the question. Why did Plato postulate forms, say? Why did Plato come up with his theory of forms? All of these are asking the same question, and that question is, why did he come up with this theory? Everything should be in service of this answer, everything you say. And the first thing you'll need to say is, why aren't the objects around us, why aren't physical objects suitable as objects of knowledge? What's wrong with the the objects of perception that makes them ineligible as objects of knowledge. Effectively here, talking about the world around us being in a state of flux. This is the kind of one way of understanding it. It displays opposite features. If you're talking about Plato's forms, you need to mention these main points. Why does he come up with the theory? What does it explain? Why can't the objects around us be objects of knowledge? How can we know the forms if we can't perceive them? This is the theory of recollection and the like. So and the same thing happens with in talking about matter and form. Aristotle made a distinction between matter and form. He first made the distinction between a substance, that's a thing to you and me, and its accidents. And substantial change, that's substances coming into and going out of existence, as generation and corruption, or being made by an artifact and being destroyed. So substantial change, a thing coming into existence or a thing going out of existence, and accidental change, which is a thing acquiring features, sitting down, standing up, things that ways of the thing to exist in different ways, accidental forms. So you have this distinction, and then the distinction between matter and form, which allows Aristotle to explain substantial change. All of these things are, again, they're a set of points sort of to remember, and that is always in service of the question: why did Aristotle bring in the distinction between matter and form? What is his theory meant to explain? In a sense, these are relatively straightforward. The thing is to keep to the point. Don't wander off the point. And as I said, everything should be in service of answering the question in some sort of methodical sense. It isn't, you don't have a huge number of words to deal with, so don't misuse them by having introductions or rambling sort of asides or this kind of thing. Everything should answer the question. So, I've said enough in the last lecture on form and Aristotle, on form and matter, and Plato on the forms. I won't go into that in any more detail. And as I said, I put up notes on the net, on the web, that explain this. I also mentioned some of, particularly in Aquinas, how Aquinas accommodated Christian beliefs into Aristotelian thinking, how he modified Aristotle's way of thinking. And this will be something that will be useful for the examinations. Again, you'll see the notes. So really on Aquinas' use of philosophy in explaining his theological positions, and his use of Aristotelian philosophy and his modification of Aristotle in order to accommodate Christian beliefs, to effectively broaden Aristotle's system, using some Arabic distinctions made in Arabic philosophy in order to explain Christian doctrines. And that is where, as I said last time, in addition to generation and corruption being the two natural ways for things to come into existence and go out of existence, Aquinas then said there's other ways of coming into existence. Creation, which is an immediate coming into being by God, somehow not matter and form coming together naturally, but really a supernatural coming into being. And then effectively the natural way of going out of existence is corruption, matter and form separate, and Aquinas said there's a different way of going out of existence, and that is the possibility of God annihilating something. So that angels, in this case, can't arise naturally. They're created. They can't go out of existence naturally, but they could be annihilated. They could be put out of existence by God. And there's the distinction between that when things that aren't absolutely necessary beings like God, on Aquinas' view, God is utterly simple, has no composition, no separate parts, either metaphysical or physical. and no composition. Angels, Aquinas thought, do have composition of a kind, not of matter and form, but of essence and existence. And this is lacking in God. There is no distinction between essence and existence. So, again, these are all the things that I mentioned last time, and I have notes up on about Aquinas broadening the Aristotelian account to accommodate and explain, indeed, these Christian doctrines. Right, I'll go on. Well, I might start with the pre-Socratics, because I'm going to go back. The one thing I can say is I'm not going to have a question on Socrates himself, and that is the Socratic dialogues in the examination. So you'll have pre-Socratics, Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine and Thomas Aquinas will be discussed. Socrates, simply because anything involving Socrates really will involve a knowledge of the texts. Simply because Socrates doesn't have a large sort of system of doctrine that we can draw upon or learn about. It's everything about his approach to philosophical reasoning, and therefore it's just too difficult in a short course like this to have a question of this sort, I think. So no Socrates. So, but I will discuss one thing in one kind of very important aspect of pre-Socratic thinking, and that is the distinction between appearance and reality. So this distinction between the way things are of themselves in the world themselves and the way they appear to us. This is an important distinction, and indeed this really also covers the distinction between the one and the many distinction. That all of these things that appear, all of this different kind of variegated and varied array of things in the world around us are explained by appeal to one arche, one kind of principle, or several principles. There's a more fundamental account of all of this complexity in the world. This fundamentally is explained by a much simpler system that underlies all of the things that appear around us. And this also, if you can see it this way, this also involves the distinction between appearance and reality. So on this issue, both these things are sort of under consideration. I mentioned before the atomists, and that they're not explicitly mentioned in the text, but they are relatively easy to understand to the extent that they seem to predict a lot of things that we have subsequently found to be true. So other things aren't, but they made good speculations. But that we can understand sort of clearly in the case of the atomists what the distinction between appearance and reality is. All of the colours and things that we experience, according to the atomists, are simply because we detect surfaces and things as having these colours. In reality, they're made up of combinations of colourless, tiny, in fact, imperceptible atoms. Likewise, with smells, with all of the senses, these things are the sensations are particular to us. They're not corresponding to something in the world, though they are caused by these clumps, atoms, gathering together in particular ways. So the pre-Socratics, this sort of distinction, the appearance and reality, and trying to get to what's behind it, trying to explain the one and the many, that this underlying principle that causes all of the varied perceptions of the world around us. This is really a simpler, I won't say precisely primitive, but certainly a simpler version of what we now call metaphysics. This is what they were engaging in. They were, as well as being scientists, they were engaged in metaphysical speculation about the underlying features of the world about us. They weren't willing, as with Plato, they weren't willing to limit themselves to the things that we can sense directly through the senses. So the search for this arche, the ultimate element, or the search for a logos, an ultimate account, these are related to the issues of the one and the many, which is again falls under the kind of umbrella of the distinction between appearance and reality. Effectively, things as they appear and ultimate reality, the deeper structure of the world. So, we can see that physics is probably where the distinction between appearance and reality can be seen most starkly. The atomists indeed thought that the experience of the perceptible world, all of the sensations, colours, tastes, smells, are really caused by groupings of imperceptible atoms, and indeed our bodies are made up of these imperceptible tiny atoms, and of course void. And so you have the two ultimate principles: beings, tiny atoms, and empty space, the void, and they group together in such a way that causes all of the things around us, including our own bodies. The atomists, when discussing the soul, they even thought that the soul was material in some sort of sense. Though it's again it's hard for them as for us to explain. Stoics likewise were of the same type of strong materialist sense. So when you get to other philosophers like in Empedocles, is he's the fellow who believes that the world was made up of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. These are the ones that Aristotle ultimately adopted and made their way really fairly unchanged right through the Middle Ages until the later Middle Ages, where they started coming up with sort of a more complex views about chemistry, really. And in Empedocles you also have these opposing forces of love and strife. And somehow these types of forces have the elements hanging together, and they form this kind of structure. So we can distinguish the appearance from reality here. It's what we experience from what something is really like. So you have these sort of hidden features that hang together in such a way as to explain the world, the kind of the world of appearances, the world of perception. So, again, pretty much all of the pre-Socratics will be relatively relevant in thinking about a question like this. Obviously Parmenides is the one where the distinction between appearance and reality is greatest. Mark Cohen's notes have a very clear, I think part 2 has a very, very clear and very brief explanation of how Parmenides came to his extraordinary reasoning that the world of appearance is completely mistaken, and in fact there's only one thing. There's no change, no movement, no time, and all of this through rather simple argument that got him into his position. And of course in Heraclitus likewise you have this idea that the world is somehow, as it appears, it is in a state of flux, but in fact under that there is a logos uniting things that makes the world function. So you have the unity of opposites operating in this kind of sort of a proto-metaphysics, like a simpler certainly what became metaphysics later on. And so, granting this type of distinction, we can sort of abstract from all of the different pre-Socratic philosophers we've had a look at, and what you want to do is discuss them under this sort of heading of appearance, reality, and indeed the one of the many, the search for the arche. So I'm going to go on, I think, because we're going to march on for time. I'm going to go on to talk about Aquinas and faith and reason. Of course, we did discuss some of his philosophical additions to Aristotle in relation to his interest in explaining Christian doctrines using the Aristotelian system. And when he discussed what faith is, he also availed himself of the distinctions that came from Aristotle. And this is the distinction, we find this as well in some of the Neoplatonists who got this from Aristotle. That's the distinction between the will and the intellect. And I've got a little article which I've put a link to, Aristotle and Aquinas, from the Cambridge Companion to Aquinas, and another short one. The links are up on the meeting room, and that's another little article on theology and philosophy from the end of the Cambridge Companion as well. And again, I've pointed out what sections are useful. You know, the whole thing is probably not as relevant, but a couple of sections that might be of interest. So Aquinas had the view that some religious truths are provable by unaided human reason, by reasoning alone, and whereas others must be held on faith if they're to be believed at all. He was really at pains to show that faith is reasonable. He thought that the notion, like this is pretty much the case of most of the medieval philosophers, that they had the idea that blind faith really would be a contradiction in terms. It was believing something for no reason. If you like, if someone asks, "Why do you believe this?" and you say, "No reason." How sustainable is this type of belief? It looks as though that it has about as much warrant behind it, about as much reason for thinking it's true as anything else. That you can simply switch your beliefs with something else, and there's no reason to believe that either. So Aquinas thought that faith was a reasonable position. He thought that it was kind of epistemically rational, reasonable, even though it wasn't. That things held on faith weren't knowable, strictly speaking, at least in this life. So Aquinas had the position, which we find in Augustine as well, that there are certain religious beliefs, religious truths that can be established by pure reason, but that these are not sufficient to bring human happiness or sufficient for salvation. And so he thought, on his view, there are certain things we need to do in order to achieve salvation, but also certain things we need to believe to be true. And it's putting it in this way, it looks a little unusual, and perhaps it is, but it's worth sort of seeing this as a true picture of what Aquinas is doing. So, if you think about what Aquinas considered to be rational, and what he considered not rational. So he thought that all the things that we know about, he thought that you could prove, for instance, that God exists. He thought that you could prove that the soul is immortal, and he thought that this was then sufficient basis for it to be rational, for various reasons, for it to be rational to believe the things that had to be held on faith. Aquinas thought that unless some doctrines are provable by unaided reason, that the mind can prove them without any intervention from God, without the need for faith. On his view, religious faith would be irrational unless there are some things that we can prove to be true. This is why he says, in the quotation I'm going to give you in a while, he says, faith presupposes natural knowledge. So his thinking is that there are certain things that we cannot have access to, through knowledge. We can't know. But there are certain things we can know, and then other things that we can believe on faith. And indeed, that he thought it required belief of some things being held on faith. Augustine, this is a common view, and Aquinas is probably important in that he stated it very clearly using this Aristotelian system. So I'll just read through some of these things. But the quotations are up online. I think I put them up, but if I haven't, I will put them up. So this is from the Summa Theologiae, this summation of theology, his great this great work. And he quoted Augustine, saying, "Faith is a virtue whereby we believe what we do not see." And I quoted John Damascene as saying, "Faith is an assent without inquiry." And so, in another quotation, he says, "There is nothing to prevent a man who cannot grasp a proof from accepting, as a matter of faith, something which in itself is capable of being scientifically known and demonstrated." Scientifically there means scientia. It means it can be proved rationally. "The existence of God and other like truths about God, which can be known by natural reason, are not articles of faith, but are preambles to the articles of, for faith presupposes natural knowledge." So, strangely enough, the existence of God is not, on Aquinas' view, an article of faith. And again, he says there's nothing to stop someone from holding these beliefs on faith alone, without going through the philosophical reasoning. Not everyone's got the time or the sort of inclination. But he did think that somebody must be able to prove it. He thought it has to be provable in order for it to be rational. Not that everyone has to go around the place proving these things, but he thought it must be provable. So, on Aquinas' view, he thought that using this distinction between the will and the intellect being here the sort of thinking mind, and the will is what drives us to do things. I can make a decision to take a drink of water because I'm driven towards some end. There's some good involved in me doing something. So that's what the will does. And on Aquinas' view, the will is naturally directed towards the good. In the case of faith, the will moves the intellect to believe because of the supreme good represented in the faith. So, if you think of an instance of, I know that this pen exists. Well, here the intellect, on Aristotle's view, which Aquinas is using, the intellect is moved overwhelmingly for me to believe this. I know it's absolutely true. All the evidence is there. The intellect is moved. I'm 100% certain that there's a pen here. So let's have a think about believing something. We'll call it a proposition. Well, the proposition in logic is very often we use the shorthand P for the proposition. So let's have a think about this. This is the proposition P, and this is a little tilde. It means not P. So let's say, in the instance of there's a pen in my pocket, the intellect is moved 100% for me to believe that there's a pen in my pocket. There are chairs in this room. You can't see them, but my intellect is moved. There are chairs here. Let's say that there's something that I have a vague opinion about. let's say I know that James Galway is on tour, the great flautist from Belfast, and I make a guess that maybe it's this week that James Galway is in Belfast. Sorry, I'm just trying to stop my battery dying here. So I've got a vague opinion that he's on tour, and I venture an opinion that he so yeah, I think there's a good chance he's in Belfast. But I've got very little evidence. If I'm being rational, then the level of my belief will correspond to the evidence. If I think isn't he semi-retired in Switzerland, then I'll say he's not in Belfast. Somehow, at any time, for being rational, the amount of my evidence should correspond to the strength of my belief. I have a vague notion that James Galway might be in Belfast, then I'll follow the evidence and say I'm not too certain he is. I'm inclined to doubt it, or if I have more evidence, I'll be inclined to favour it a bit more. But this is at the level of opinion, and the strength of my opinion should mirror the evidence I have. So what of faith? So this is Aquinas's discussion here. This is his quotation. Divine providence directs men to a higher good than human frailty can experience in the present life. The mental faculties ought to be evoked and led onward to something higher than our reason can attain at present, learning thereby to desire something and earnestly to tend to something that transcends the entire state of the present life. This is talking about being directed to a higher good. Again, not supernatural here, but directing oneself to what one perceives as good. And it is also in this way that we are moved to believe what someone says, because the reward of eternal life is promised to us if we believe. And the will is moved by this reward to assent to the things that are said, even though the intellect is not moved by what is understood. So, how does this work on this picture with the believing something and not believing the P? So, on Aquinas' view, the things that are held on faith are held with a high degree of certainty, even though they have a low degree of evidence, or certainly not enough degree of evidence to warrant anything more than an opinion. So, say if the evidence I have for some religious proposition is down here, I don't have, certainly according to Aquinas, you don't have enough to warrant knowledge, but the degree of certainty is close to that of knowledge. So how is this? Well, Aquinas thinks that it's the will that moves by the desire for the good. The will moves the intellect to assent to the believing in this proposition. And he also thinks that there's a secondary thing that moves as well as the will, which is what he calls infused grace. And that's God supernaturally moving someone to believe with certainty something for which they have insufficient evidence. So both the will drawn towards the ultimate good and infused grace are somehow meant to bridge this gap between the high level of certainty that people have in faith and the apparently low level of evidence. This is what's happening is an attempt to show how faith can happen, how you can have this high certainty, though lacking in the evidence, and explaining how it can be rational. One of the ways, of course, as well as this infused grace and the will being drawn, he thinks it can be rational only if these preambles can be established by pure reason. And there's a sort of a school of thinking that Aquinas wasn't really trying to be a foundationalist, if you like, that he didn't have the idea that there's this foundational metaphysical basis, though that certainly looks as though it's Aristotle's position. And Ralph McInerney, the late American philosopher, wrote a book called Preambula Fide, The Preambles of Faith, where he took it seriously that this is somehow an Aristotelian foundational project, that you require this. So, and this is what so the next quotation is about this infused grace in the will. Faith, as regards the assent, which is the chief act of faith, is from God moving man inwardly by grace. So again, this is an alteration of the Aristotelian system of the intellect and the will. The will is moving the intellect to assent in this instance. And so he also had an idea that being moved by lesser truths and this ultimate truth would not give you the same type of rationality. And so this gives a sort of an indication as to why Aquinas thought that faith could be reasonable, and why the Aristotelian system is, he thought, the kind of directest way of showing that this is a reasonable system. So, right, and again, some of the other things that we did mention before on his use of the Aristotelian system of generation and corruption and the like, but also you find there's a close relative of Aristotle's unmoved mover, the proof of the existence of Aristotle's God, which you find in Metaphysics, Book 12. And the first way is of Aquinas, which is mentioned in the text, is pretty much a version of this. The second and third ways, again, are closely related to the Aristotelian proof of the existence of God. The difference, of course, is that on Aristotle's view, the unmoved mover, that God moves the beings in the universe not in the way that efficient causes move, that I move this with my finger, but it's moved in the way that a painting moves someone or a piece of music moves them, as an object of desire. So the unmoved mover remains completely unmoved. Aristotle's God isn't remotely interested in the world. It didn't create the world. It doesn't appear that it thinks about the world at all. It's thought thinking itself, but is moved as an object of desire, and that's why literally the universe moves in a circle around it. And things seek to mimic the unmoved mover. In Aquinas' case, it's an efficient cause. So the first way pretty certainly fails because of what we know about forces now. That any two forces push against each other. One isn't prior to the other. They actually exert the same opposite force on each other. So that doesn't work. But the second and third ways are still held in good esteem by some philosophers. And I put a description, or I will if I haven't. I think I haven't, but I will put up a kind of an analysis of how things are, how the proof is sort of structured in Aquinas' view. His idea is that not all causes can be these intermediary causes. So if A is caused by B, and B is caused by C, and C is caused by D, that these types of kind of immediate causes, not every cause can be of that kind. And when he talks about potentiality and actuality, that if I push someone because someone is pushing me, and they push me because someone is pushing them, that not all the causes can be this kind of intermediary cause. There must be a first one, or not only won't you be able to, so the two things, not only won't you be able to explain why I get pushed, or explain the final, event that we're explaining. Not only will you lack an explanation, but you wouldn't have a movement. That's the important thing. It's not just an explanatory regress that you get. It's that if Aquinas is correct, there would be no movement if all causes were these intermediary type causes. If you think of the way, because on Aquinas' view these are simultaneous causes as well, if you imagine someone in a very tall building saying, so you're on the whatever 800th floor of some massively tall building. Why does the 800th floor, what keeps it up? And they went, well, it's the one below. And what keeps that up? But the one below that keeps it up. This is definitely true. It's also true that in a more fundamental way, the lower floors all keep my floor from falling through the ground. The 799th floor is propped up by the 798th. That's a more ultimate explanation. But it's also the case that they can't all be. Not all the floors can be kept in existence because there's simply a floor below. There must be some bedrock. That's the idea on Aquinas' view. Sort of a little analogy, but that's the idea. Not only would you lack an explanation, which you would, but there could never have been this motion in the first way. There could never have been this actualization of a potential in the second way. And the third way is quite tricky. It's talking about necessity and actuality. But again, it's the same idea. You have the same type of regress that will occur. And this isn't to do with infinite time either. Aquinas thought, and it's widely seen to be correct, that his arguments, if they work at all, they would still work even if the world had an infinite past, if there were no beginning, an actual beginning of time. It's not that type of infinity he's talking about. He's talking about an infinity in explanations, that you have... You can't have an infinite number of causes that are per se required for a certain effect. And so it's not like, the grandfather is necessary for the existence of the father is necessary for the existence of the son. But, if the grandfather and the father die, the son can continue to do things, can have children, These effects they're not simultaneous, and as they say, they're not per se. So it's the idea is that this type of deep structural explanation, on Aquinas' view, it must terminate somewhere. And he then at the end of his of the different ways he says, and this all men call God, or some other formula like this. And there's sometimes dismissed as saying that's awfully quick to say that there is some first cause in this series, and this men call God. He actually did spend quite a bit of time in the subsequent articles in the Summa establishing that indeed the first cause in these different series is equivalent to God. So I'm going to put up a little bit of that to make it a bit clearer. You can't it can't be gone into an enormous amount of detail because we've got other things to do. But it was incidentally the move from the unmoved mover to being a creator is something that happened in Neoplatonism. That I think it was not Simplicius, but Syrianus. It was Syrianus, the Greek philosopher, who said that what's responsible for this infinite motion, because he thought the world has always existed and is always in this circular motion, what's responsible for this infinite motion must also be responsible for the existence of the universe. And that was a sort of a new thing. And of course this was then picked up in Christianity, who found this explanation something that they could get on board with. So I'm going to look at Augustine on faith and reason. Again, there are a few little texts I put up which might be interesting, and Augustine on knowledge. And probably most of the stuff in the text is actually about Augustine on knowledge, and so there'll probably be worth thinking about the different kinds of knowledge that different possibilities of knowledge Augustine thought there were. And so this includes illumination and his anti-skeptical arguments, perhaps even his mysticism, and his belief that certain things could be proved. As with Aquinas later on, he thought that there are many religious doctrines that could be proved to the by the human intellect, unaided by God. So I'll read this little text from the Confessions. I've got a link to this. Some of the others I won't read, simply because it'll take away our time from discussing another issue, which is the usefulness of philosophy to theologians. Why would theologians need philosophy? Why would philosophy benefit them? And again, when I mention this, this will be the stuff we're looking at on Aquinas and Augustine, of course, will be relevant to this. This is why in the paper there will be different questions where you have A or B, answer one or other, not both. The reason that's not both is because there's too much of an overlap. You'll end up repeating yourself, and it simply wouldn't be fair. So when you see A or B, do not under any circumstances do both. Even if you think, I can't really write on anything else, you can only be graded on one, just because of fairness. So if you say A or B, pick only one, because the reason it's been done is there is an overlap. So you pick one or other questions, just to give you more range of what you want to write about. So this is Augustine in the Confessions, and of course sometimes it's a little bit difficult to read Augustine's philosophy, or his writings in general, because it's not as clear as in Thomas Aquinas. Again, people disagree that Aquinas actually did philosophy. I think he obviously did. But it's relatively clear to distinguish Aquinas' theology from his philosophy, despite the fact a lot of what I've been doing here, talking about philosophy, is in explanation of theological kind of ends. But what's happening is he's discussing something from a philosophical point of view. Augustine has this probably a more blurred distinction between philosophy and theology, and sometimes you can't see very clearly if he's presenting an argument, because it's like a lot of Platonism. The system is coherent from within, but there's sometimes not an enormous amount of argumentation into showing that it's actually true. They're showing that it's consistent. But Augustine, of course, was also a professor of rhetoric, so sometimes you find very beautifully phrased things where there's more rhetoric going on. He's very fond of having words that have a similar etymology, and sometimes, wordplay and the like. So sometimes he goes into pure rhetoric and there isn't a lot of argumentation going on at all. But sometimes you can see quite clearly what he's up to philosophically. Here is a little account of how he got interested in Platonism through a friend of his who was a convert, who I think reconverted to some form of paganism. But he'd give him some of the works of Plotinus, which he never mentions by name, but this is the quotation from the middle of it's book 7 of the Confessions. You procured for me, he's addressing God here, through one inflated with the most monstrous pride, certain books of the Platonists translated from Greek into Latin, and therein I found, not indeed in the same words, but to the self-same effect, enforced by many and various reasons, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him nothing. Without him was not anything made that was made. That which was made by him is life, and the life was the light of men. And he goes on. Yes, and further, that he was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. But that he came unto his own, and his own received him not, and as many as received him, to them give the power, or become the sons of God, even to them that believed in his name. This I did not find there. So the thing that he didn't find in Neoplatonism is the incarnation. And there's a little article I've made a link to. You can have a read of it. It's an interesting thing. The gist of it is this. and it's by an American philosopher called Peter King. He's a scholar of Duns Scotus and Abelard and various medieval philosophers. Very interesting chap. And he wrote a little article called Augustine's Encounter with Neoplatonism, and he discussed this text and what was going on. So Augustine seemed to believe that the Neoplatonists believed in a trinity. It's certainly true that there is some sort of Trinitarian type thinking going on, but it's definitely not the Trinity of Christianity. What you have in Neoplatonism is this being, one, they call it Hon, and the one overflows with being. Effectively, it's like a sort of a creation. It overflows, and then you go down. Eventually, you get to this is the world soul, and all other beings come down. So effectively, all of the world, all of creation, is the overflowing of the one. And this Hon, the Logos here, and the Psyche, the world soul, so that the spirit. Y-C-H-E. So and eventually you get down to, this is the purest being, and at the bottom you have nothingness, and above that a little bit matter. So there's this big, again, a variegated view of the world. The notion in Neoplatonism is that you have eternal, this outpouring of being, and return. So you have emanation from the one, and then return. Effectively, all of the beings down here are returning to the one. It's this proper, it's like a big, as John Dillon, the Neoplatonist in Trinity called it, it's like a chocolate fountain of reality, constantly happening, returning to the one. So, Peter King speculated that what Augustine had found was a solution to a problem in Neoplatonism that Neoplatonism couldn't fix. Plotinus thought that the human souls are pure, ultimately. So the question arises, why haven't we returned to the one yet? If we're outpourings from the one, if we're emanations from the one, here we are, we're destined to return. Why haven't we returned if the soul is pure? So later Neoplatonists thought that the soul probably wasn't pure, needed to be purified by prayers, by different religious activities, by propagation of these the demons, these kind of angelic beings, intermediary beings. So you can, if with the help of intermediary beings, we can somehow return to the one. And here's what's going on with Augustine. Likely a good and interesting story, at least. And that's that if the one is infinite and we're finite, then any intermediary being will be no good to us, because either it's finite like us, or it's infinite like the one. So any number of intermediary beings will be of no help. So what's to be done? Well, it looks as though what Augustine has spotted is that there's a solution to this emanation and return, and that's that there's a being who crosses this entire boundary between us and the God. And that, of course, is explained by the incarnation, on Augustine's view. So again, philosophical, or rather a theological claim, but a philosophical solution to a problem in Neoplatonism. Excuse me. So you have effectively, on Augustine's view, that Christianity can solve a problem that Neoplatonism had difficulty with. And indeed, there's quite a bit, if you read through Confessions, if you have it here, Henry Chadwick's translation, he has all of the little pieces that Augustine borrowed from Plotinus. It's probably too early to talk about plagiarism, but there's quite a bit of Augustine's reasoning is straight lifted from Plotinus, and he very often assumes that what's going on is far closer to Christianity than it actually is in the Neoplatonists. And he also, develops his own kinds of views. So, and again, I'll mention this little quotation as well. It's mentioned in the same article. It's from Contra Academicos, which means against the skeptics. The academics at this time, the skeptics had taken over the Plato's Academy. So, against the academics means against the skeptics. And this is Augustine, again, like later on Aquinas, thinking that there are some things that you can hold on faith, but other things can be known as well. So this is the quotation. As for what is to be sought out by the most subtle reasoning, for my character is such that I am impatient in my desire to apprehend what the truth is, not only through belief, but also through the understanding. I am confident that I am going to find it with the Platonists, and that it won't be opposed to our Holy Writ. So this is an important thing to just about Augustine's psychology. There's a sort of a caricature of medieval philosophers, and Augustine in particular, that what he was doing is just grabbing any old argument to try and prop up this big, complicated set of religious doctrines and try to find anything to try and make it more reasonable. It's perfectly clear in this instance, as he said, he's interested in finding, he's not satisfied always with holding things on faith. He believes things on faith, but he wants to know them. He wants to have a higher degree of higher grade of knowledge. So in this instance, you can see, having evidence that's over here, that's what you end up with faith. You believe it with certainty, but lacking in evidence. He wants to have sufficient evidence, sufficient reasoning to be able to know something as proper demonstration, as a proper piece of knowledge. And he said, the important part, he said, I am confident that I'm going to find it with the Platonists, and that it won't be opposed to the Holy Writ, to our Holy Writ. So he wants to go where the argument leads him, but he's confident that it won't contradict the scriptural account that's on his view. So it's not that he's trying to find any argument to defend what he already believes. He wants to find out the truth, and he just seems to be fairly confident that it won't oppose Christianity. Of course, he thinks Christianity is true. So it shows that there's quite a degree of kind of a genuine philosophical spirit in his confidence there as well, and that kind of a philosophical outlook. So I'm going to skip through this actually, because there's more to be said on faith and reason, but I've just put up a set of quotations and a couple of articles if you're interested as well, if you want to spend an hour just kind of diving through some of these things. They're kind of interesting. On divine illumination, again, this is part of it's related to faith and reason. But also it's related to kind of a purely epistemological set of questions as well. So there's going to be this overlap, so there won't be questions on both faith and reason and knowledge, or at least you won't be able to do both. But on divine illumination, there is an excellent little article by David Pasnow, I think, on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I'll put a link up. You don't need to read all of it. The most important part is the introduction, the part on Augustine, and the sort of the late medieval bit might be of interest as well. The people like Bonaventure, the Franciscan Bonaventure, and some of these guys who were in favour of keeping Augustine's theory of divine illumination in opposition to the theory that was replacing it, which is Aristotle's view of abstraction, that you don't need illumination if you have Aristotle's theory of abstraction. So that article is excellent, and yes, the 13th century debate is also of interest, though it's not directly, not super important, but it's interesting. So if you look at, I think I mentioned the last day about what's inadequate in our knowledge of the world according to Plato, that this world is sort of just a bit too flimsy, and so we had this idea of the circle, and that we're more likely to call it a badly drawn circle rather than an irregularly, or a perfectly drawn irregular figure. And, we somehow get these similar ideas from these are all different shapes, and yet when we look at all of them we think, yeah, that's lots of badly drawn circles. On Augustine's view, he can't help himself to recollection of the forms. On his view, these kinds of knowledge, where the senses are inadequate to give us knowledge, it's God intervenes in this instance with divine illumination, giving us knowledge, in effect. There is a relationship between this and what Augustine thinks of grace. Grace, of course, is not to do with knowledge, but to do with moral action, if you like. So it's a little tricky to discuss that on Augustine because his views are, again, a little unusual. The idea on Augustine's view, he had a fairly gloomy view of human nature. He thought that anything we do, because of original sin, anything we do will tend towards bad. No matter how morally we try to act, we will act badly. That's our nature. So what happens when we act well? Well, he thinks that at any point when I go through the world, I will act badly. Anytime I do something good, it's because God intervenes at that point with grace. At every single instance. This leaves a problem, of course, which was seen right away, that it looks as though we've got troubles with free will now. Left to my own devices, I will do evil. That's it. But anytime I do good, it's because God intervenes to kind of compel me to do good. Also requiring that I'm baptized. That people who aren't baptized can't do good at all because they won't get grace. So this is, obviously problematic for the notion of free will and for the kind of fairness of the world. But the same thing's going on in a different sphere on Augustine's on knowledge. So at every point I do a piece of reasoning that works out, it's because God intervenes with illumination. Less important in this instance is Augustine probably did think that pagans, strictly speaking, couldn't do mathematics. They couldn't find mathematical truths because, again, this involves God illuminating people, and he probably restricted that to Christians. So the theory probably falls apart right there as a theory of knowledge. But in the text it sort of implies that what Augustine needed illumination for was for necessary truths. You might. It's certainly the case that he required it for just about everything. The article that I've posted up from the Cambridge Companion to Augustine makes that fairly clear. That Augustine said we wouldn't know what a head covering is for except by illumination. So it's sort of in the definition. What's a head covering? Well, it covers heads. It's for covering a head. He thought we couldn't even know that without divine illumination. So it's you might think that the one dispensing with words or at least with numbers, the one thing that's kind of fairly obvious is that this many things plus this many things is that many things. 2 plus 2 is 4. That's a necessary truth. It's something that can't. It's if you try and doubt it, it generates contradictions, undermining kind of all thought. It doesn't appear too obvious that we need illumination for this kind of truth, though some philosophers, some commentators say that they're precisely the truths that Augustine requires illumination for. It's he does say that's important, but it's effectively everything. Every type of knowledge is requires illumination because, again, we can't have got this through the senses. So I think we're going to end up running a little bit out of time, but I think probably I've got enough written on that. I was going to read out a little bit of David Passanham, which might be useful. I'll do that now just before the tutorial, just because it might be of help. So, he says in this, I understand a theory of divine illumination to be a theory on which the human mind regularly relies on some kind of special supernatural assistance in order to complete some part of its ordinary cognitive activity. The assistance of a supernatural, of course, must be supernatural, of course, or else it would not count as divine illumination. It must be special in the sense that it is something more than a divine creation and ongoing conservation of the human mind. The mind must regularly rely on the assistance in order to complete its ordinary cognitive activity. Otherwise, its occasional mystical experience might suffice to confirm any theory of divine illumination. But a defender of the theory need only hold that we require this assistance for some part of our ordinary cognitive activities. Hardly anyone has supposed that every form of cognition requires illumination. So the thing here is it's very, very highly Platonic in that it is the case that we don't perceive equality, circularity and all these things, and the world does display these opposite features. And not being able to rely on recollection, Augustine thought he relied on divine illumination. So he did think that pagans could have a high degree of certainty about lots of things, but he probably denied that they could have true knowledge because they were lacking this divine illumination. So now on the when discussing Augustine on knowledge, it again, as well as illumination and sort of going into why Augustine required illumination and what sort of nature illumination had. You can mention his arguments against skepticism. That there are some types of knowledge that are skeptic proof. Disjunctions, either snow exists or snow doesn't exist. That's true even in an empty universe. And knowledge of appearances, that it appears that things might be a particular way, even if they're not. The appearance is somehow undoubtable as well. And there are some of his little accounts as well on mysticism, as that the senses give some kind of added information about the mind of God, that you've this type of mystical grasp of the divine. And that's also relevant if you want to discuss it. Again, anti-skepticism and illumination are probably the most important in thinking of the ways in which he thought knowledge was possible. So, as well as mentioning the ways that which we did this time and the last time, that Aquinas had modified and kind of added to Aristotelian thinking to accommodate Christian beliefs, there's the wider sort of question on the relationship between philosophy and theology. What has this historical relationship been? And then there's the slightly narrower question, if you like. The one is simply the relationship between philosophy and theology. In one way, some theologies have very little to do with philosophy. Some theologians have open disdain for philosophy, and lots of philosophers get on with philosophy without any contact at all with theology. So in some respect, they can have commonalities of interests and of methodology, but they could exist independently. So there is a narrower question: how might theology benefit from philosophy? Or another way of putting it is, how might theologians use philosophy? And indeed, historically, how did they use philosophy? How did some of the philosopher theologians we've discussed, indeed many of the great philosophers of the Middle Ages, were better known as theologians, or indeed like Augustine was a bishop and a theologian. Anselm was likewise a teacher of theology, and so with Bonaventure, Thomas Aquinas, Henry of Ghent, John Duns Scotus, William of Ockham, Francesco Suarez in the Renaissance. All of these people had positions as professors of theology, but wrote extensively in philosophy. Thomas Aquinas was, even as professor of theology, was still producing commentaries on Aristotle, so it wasn't the case that he thought that all philosophy, in some sense, must immediately serve the interests of theology. But, again, these relationships are, kind of historical interest, but the narrow question is, how did theologians use philosophy? What are the different ways in which they used philosophy and philosophical reasoning? So there's a sort of a central historical role that philosophy has played in theology right from the earliest times, even during the period of the Church Fathers. And one of them is, historically, the Christians found out that their opponents in the public sphere were philosophers. So they just happened to fall into using the same types of reasoning that they were being attacked with. They adopted the same type of dialectical ability to try and defend their views. So this is just really philosophy as dialectic or as logic. Philosophy was seen as a tool for articulating and explaining theological ideas, to avoid ambiguity, importantly, and to bring about clarity in these complex theological discussions and in explaining these complex theological ideas. And this is what I might call a fairly minimal use of philosophy, which is summed up by the phrase, philosophy is the handmaid of theology. And this means that philosophical methods, such as logic, can be used as tools in philosophical discussions. But at the same time, pretty much what they were doing was still pure theology. It wasn't going off into its own kind of realm of purely philosophical discourse. You can see how this might be important, even for those who are dismissive of philosophy. No matter how coherent your ideas are, no matter how good your arguments are, if your language is full of ambiguity, or just lack of precision, if you're not using terms very precisely, even if your ideas are clever, they will become indefensible, simply by not being clear enough. So this use of logic as a central, not even logical dialectic or argumentation, but somehow logic of terms, of getting things completely right, of saying things in a straightforward and grammatical sense, of avoiding contradiction and avoiding ambiguity. These things were essential, and still are essential to any discipline, really. And this is, philosophy in this instance can be the handmaid of any discipline. But historically, this was how it was used. Indeed, the text of Aristotle that Boethius had translated into Latin, the only works of Aristotle that survived in Latin before they were rediscovered from the Arabs in Spain in the 12th century, were works of Aristotle's logic, and in Latin they were known as the organon, a tool. So it was used as somehow a tool for dialectic, which is for debate, and for kind of logical argumentation. That was the philosophy as the handmaid of theology. So, and a second way, as well as this very minimal use that philosophy is used, is to attempt to have religious truths, religious doctrines, being established by reasoned proofs. So, presenting proofs, demonstrations as they're called in demonstratio in Latin. Demonstration means a sort of an argued proof, a rational proof of various religious truths, such as the existence of God, or the immortality of the soul, or even sometimes the immateriality of the soul, that the soul is immaterial, that it's non-material. So both Augustine and Aquinas, and others indeed, thought that at least some of the Christian doctrines were provable in this way. As time went on, for various reasons, there was a general feeling that fewer and fewer Christian doctrines were provable. And nowadays you get some theologians who say that no doctrines can be demonstrated in this way. So Duns Scotus, in the generation after Aquinas, believed that you could prove that the soul was non-material, but that this was not enough to prove that it was immortal. He said he thought that must be accepted on faith, whereas Aquinas thought that you could prove it's immaterial and that it was therefore immortal. Scotus thought you could prove the existence of God, that God was necessary, same as Aquinas. Duns Scotus thought that you could that you couldn't prove that there weren't more than one, gods. You couldn't prove there was only one, but you could prove there was only one that was related to this universe, that it was that was the cause of this universe. But he somehow thought, no, the idea that there's only one God is something we must accept on faith. There's no absolute proof for this. William of Ockham went even further. He thought that you couldn't prove that there was only one God, even in relation to this world. So part of the reason for this, one is that nominalism, which is this view that there aren't shared natures, like I was saying with effectively on the picture that the world is structured full of essences that are the objects of knowledge, and these are what the relata of causes. So the proof of the existence of God involves these lists of essential causes being ranked. So as nominalism took over in the later Middle Ages, people became they found greater problems in explaining causation, and as a consequence fewer things they thought were provable. The other thing is that people simply philosophers became a bit more circumspect and a bit more precise about what they had to satisfy them as a proof. And so it wasn't, it wasn't because of increasing skepticism about the power of reason. It was more precision about the nature of what a proof is. Of course, when you then get to the Reformation, reason is kind of thrown under the bus, and Luther thought that reasoning would systematically mislead us. And this is really for the first time that people thought that blind faith was the only hope. And in part this was because, despite the fact he claimed to be an Augustinian, Augustine of course said the intellect can mislead us, and often does, but of course this is all we have. It's just kind of a divinely given power, and usually the intellect's pretty good. On Luther's view, the intellect itself was completely fallen and totally lost, and he thought that you need only blind faith. Check out the contents of this book, and that's it. Unsurprisingly, within a generation or so, many of the Protestant academics returned to philosophical works and to kind of the late medieval nominalism, and started doing philosophy again. Otherwise, you simply have to bite the bullet and say, there's no reason at all I believe any of this. And that's probably not too comfortable a position to be in. In terms of proving things to be, proving religious doctrines, probably the list of things that were thought to be the longest list of things that a philosopher thought provable was probably with Anselm, who ended up in Canterbury, who wrote the Periphyseon and famously what became known as the ontological argument. He thought all kinds of things could be provable. He even thought that he didn't think it was provable that the incarnation happened. Of course, that's being a historical claim. It's not something susceptible to philosophical proof. But he did think it possible to prove that humans couldn't be saved without it happening. It was quite a long list. But yes, so as time went on, the sort of the accepted list of things of religious doctrines that were provable definitely diminished over time. So a third way that philosophy has been historically used in theology is in demonstrating that certain doctrines, while they might not be provable, that there might not be a proof that shows that they're true, they can at least be shown to be coherent and consistent. And Aquinas, for example, Aquinas and Augustine indeed, and many of the other philosophers we were talking about, thought that the Trinity was a doctrine that could be proved philosophically. First of all, an account could be given of the Trinity using philosophical terms, using philosophical distinctions and relations, and then the Trinity could be described in this philosophical sense, and it could be shown that it's a coherent and consistent view. Really, and that's the claim, effectively, of a kind of a negative, that you can show that it isn't inconsistent. You can show that it doesn't result in contradictions. And so he didn't, Augustine, for instance, and Aquinas didn't think that the Trinity could be established, couldn't be proved philosophically, but he did Aquinas went to great lengths to show that it could, that the three persons having an identical nature and yet being distinct was indeed a consistent and coherent, logically coherent position. And of course many of these people wrote commentaries on the Trinity to do exactly this. There's another use, talking about the consistency of things, and this is kind of an extension of showing that doctrines are consistent. And this is effectively the use of logic again within theology. And this is to show that if you're committed to a certain set of beliefs, then logic will show what other beliefs you're committed to. If you hold certain beliefs, we can show by logic what follows logically from these beliefs and what other beliefs you're committed to. Effectively showing, good or bad. If you're not happy with the outcome of what is implied, then you need to change your belief. That's how the logic works. So there's a nice little example it's not from a philosophical work, but from a Christmas sermon by one of the church fathers, Cyril of Antioch. And he uses what philosophers now call Leibniz's law. So Leibniz was a great German philosopher of the 18th century. So Leibniz's law is that if A and B are identical, then any property of A is a property of B. If Superman is Clark Kent, then any property of Clark Kent is a property of Superman, and vice versa. We don't know that Clark Kent's very, very strong, but if Clark Kent is Superman, and Superman is Clark Kent, and Superman is very strong, then Clark Kent is very strong. And the way it's done in philosophy, so it's if A equals B, that's effectively if A and B are identical, then any property of A, this is the way it's done, f of A, is any property of A, equals f of B. So any property of A will be a property of B. So here's Cyril of Antioch's quick little thing. First he was talking about the natures of Christ, that Christ was meant to be, the doctrine is that Christ has two natures, a human nature and a divine nature. And it's not the case that the human nature pertains to the body or the divine nature only pertains to the soul. It's that you end up with the two natures don't belong to two different individuals or to two different parts. It's that Christ has these two complete natures, a human nature and a divine nature. And therefore, if A equals B, then any property of A is a property of B. Therefore, if Mary is the mother of Jesus, the human, and Jesus, the human, is Jesus, God, if it's one being with two natures, then Mary is the mother of God. So that's his little argumentation. Again, not using logic, That's not correct. Not using formal logic. He's using a logical argument. Cyril of Antioch using a logical argument, saying, if you believe in the two natures, this is what follows. This is what follows logically. John Henry Newman mentioned this at one point, I think, in the Apologia Pro Vita Sua. I mentioned, I think, in that where he thought that yes, this does follow. You either you, if you don't like the consequence that Mary is the mother of God, therefore Mary is the mother of the man, therefore Mary is the mother of God, then you need to go back and change your doctrine of the two natures. Effectively, it's something that follows logically, and this happens all over any type of reasoning, really. This is just one of the ways that it's been kind of historically used. I can show things that you're committed to. I can show that this is something that it logically follows from things that you believe. Therefore, either, if you're reasonable, accept the consequences, accept what follows, or go back and redraw your theory. So there's also the thought, is philosophy really that useful for theologians? I'm going to put some stuff up on this. Is it the case, for instance, that Augustine is too involved in Neoplatonism? It certainly does appear to be the case that unless something like Neoplatonism is true, then Augustine's system simply isn't viable. Likewise with Aristotle, is it too involved in Aristotle being correct to be a viable system? So you got a lot of Thomas Aquinas fans who say no, it doesn't require the truth of Aristotle, and it doesn't it doesn't involve Aristotle being absolutely correct. It is a way of explaining things, and if large parts of Aristotle go, it doesn't really affect Aquinas. Certainly things like the existence of God proof, that definitely involves a lot of Aristotle being right. His account of the Eucharist, of course, people have thought maybe that's too involved in Aristotle's belief in substance and accidents and spatial dimensions and all of these things being real categories. So it's hard to separate in some of these things. So though it's also the case that Aquinas and Augustine and others were really of the opinion that philosophy was a great aid to religious thought, to religious reasoning, and in Augustine's case, to his conversion or reconversion to Christianity, he thought that the Platonic texts were central to him realizing that Christianity was onto something, he thought. So, and of course there's also, if he's here somewhere, I've got a few quotations which I will put up online about from Eriugena and the like, who said that pure philosophy is theology, and the like. And I might even put up some stuff on the problem of evil, which is mentioned just briefly. You'll discuss it in detail when you do the course on philosophical theology. But here's Suarez talking again. He probably holds metaphysics to the sort of esteem that I have it, but very few theologians now will agree with this statement. This is Francesco Suarez from the Spanish Jesuit, from the Metaphysical Disputations, 1597. It is impossible for anyone to become a competent theologian unless he builds upon a solid metaphysical foundation. And so this was the sort of thing that, okay, some people disagree that this is what Aquinas was doing. The philosophical disputations are about this size, and they're two great big volumes, and all apparently in service ultimately of painting a kind of a thorough metaphysical theological picture. But of course, large parts of it, like this text, on various kinds of distinctions, it's not obvious that there's a lot of theological content in it at all. It's pure metaphysics, but it was done in this way to build a large sort of philosophical reasoning, metaphysical reasoning as a foundation for Christian theology and for Christian belief. So, right, as I said, I'm going to put some stuff up online, and you can now grab a quick cup of tea, and I shall see you virtually in 10 minutes or so. Okay, right, thanks, bye.